The Prince and the Pauper by Adewale Onabadejo. This presentation was initially given on the 17th of February 2019 at the Hub in Hackney. This presentation on the Prince and the Pauper will cover defining the term citizenship, understanding the value of citizenship, the relationship between citizenship, nationalism, and patriotism, the responsibility of the patriot, key concept of citizenship in the story of the Prince and the Pauper, class divide in the story, which is clearly seen, our king as the Prince and the Pauper. Right, let's define citizenship. Well, a citizen is a native or a nationalized member of a state or nation who owes allegiance to its government and is entitled to its protection, which is distinguished from alien. And you see, alien applied for me to the pauper in this particular story, though he was a citizen, and we'll see that as we go along. So, citizenship is a state of being a citizen of a particular social, political, or national community. So, it has a national application as well as a social and a political application. Now let's look at the value of citizenship, which are rights, privileges, and duties. So rights are the moral or legal entitlement given by the nation states, which comprises of authority, law, and government. Privileges are the benefits of belonging to the nation state, such as free healthcare, benefits, and so on and so forth. Duties are the responsibilities citizens have to uphold the continuity of the national state, which enables it to continue or to last. For example, we have to pay taxes, we have to vote, and do other things to make sure the nation continues. Let's have a look at the relationship between citizenship, nationalism, and patriotism. Citizenship is composed of nationalism and patriotism. So what is nationalism? Nationalism is an ideology regarding how a particular group identify themselves with their country. Patriotism, on the other hand, is an ideology regarding how a particular group of a people conduct themselves in and on behalf of their country. One is about identification, which is nationalism. The other is about conduct, which is patriotism. All right, nationalism. Let's have a deeper look at it. Nationalism is a political ideology that involves a strong identification of a group of individuals with a political entity defined in national terms, i.e. a nation. So, for example, some of the nation are conservative, so they tend to vote Conservative Party. Some are Labour, they tend to vote for Labour or liberal concept. And some, because the Conservative are more in keeping with capitalism, you tend to see people who have the ideology of capitalism or want to see that in their country vote for the Conservative. So, and right now, the Conservative are in government, so the outlook for this nation, is a conservative outlook, or the administration of it. Now, nationalism cultivates meaning for the individual drawing from the nation. So they draw from the nation's history, heritage, and also their inheritance. Nationalism provides a cause worthy of self-sacrifice. In other words, once you get into a place whereby you definitely identify yourself with that nation, you're willing to lay down your life for it. This means they are on a mission to dedicate themselves for the advancement of their nation, and they're devoted to it to their very end, even to the point of where they lay down their life. That's why you see many people who truly value their nation want to go and actually join the army and sacrifice himself in that way. Obviously not open to die, but it happens. So nationalism is cultivated through the citizen's view of the nation's history, encompassing the idea of fatherland and also motherland. Fatherland is the nation's view of one's fathers or forefathers or patriarchies. It can be viewed as a nationalist concept insofar as it relates to a nation's history. Yeah, so people look at it like that way, but not always. Motherland may refer to a mother's country, for example, the place of one's birth, the place of one's origin, if you're part of an ethnic group or a immigrant. Okay, let's have a look now at patriotism. Patriotism is a demonstration of a citizen's devotion to one's country. This means that citizens with a profound sense of identification with their nation will be patriotic. In other words, you see conduct, you see characteristics, you see everything in keeping with a nationalist kind of view. If you're a true patriot, you want to preserve your heritage, you want to preserve your history, you want to preserve your inheritance. One thing about patriots is that they have a deep appreciation for history, as I mentioned, for heritage, as I mentioned, and also for their inheritance, which is really brought to life for us in the 5 themes of citizenship, which are authority, law, government, citizenship itself, and culture. And we'll look at the patriot's responsibility when it comes to these 5 themes. So let's have a look at the responsibility of the patriots when it comes to the 5 themes. And patriots identify and conduct themselves with the 5 themes of citizenship in the following way. So what do? Citizens who value their relationship with their authority demonstrate loyalty, servitude, and also commitment. You see that from them. Citizens who value the law are what? Observant of it, they're knowledgeable of it, and they're protective of it. Citizens who value their relationship they have with their government are what? Are obedient to the government. They honor the government, and they're participatory when it comes to it. They get involved in government. They understand government. They understand the constitution. They understand the responsibility of their government, and they make sure they hold government accountable they don't feel powerless. They don't feel powerless at all. They actually are empowered because they know that they can bring the outcome that they truly desire. So citizens who value their culture are resourceful. They're very productive. They don't wait for government to do something. They do something before. They're very traditional. They understand their history, and they make sure they preserve that, and they make sure they express that. But they're also very collaborative. They get involved again. Yeah, they get involved with other citizens. They get involved when other citizens' lives are in danger, and they make sure they preserve. They don't just ignore things. They make sure they confront stuff. So here is the clip or the summary of the book The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. I want us to have a look at it and watch it about twice so that you get the overview of the story, and then we'll come back and really extract some juicy bit from this amazing book, and we'll then touch on citizenship or apply citizenship to this particular story.
This is a story about 2 boys, Tom and Edward, who live in London. Tom is born into a poor family where he is beaten by his father and grandmother, while Edward is the Prince of Wales and successor to King Henry. One day, Tom wanders near the palace and Edward invites him in. The 2 boys decide to switch places, and after they change clothes, Edward as Tom is thrown out of the palace while Tom as Edward stays in the palace. Both boys have a hard time adjusting to their new lives, as Edward realizes that he has no power and gets beaten, and Tom realizes that he's trapped in being a prince and that everyone thinks he lost his mind. Tom awkwardly makes his way through a royal meal and encounter with the king, who is looking for the Great Seal. Edward is dragged to Tom's home by Tom's father, where Edward sleeps for the night. The following day, Tom's father runs into town to escape persecution for being a man, and Edward runs away into the street crowd. Tom attends a big dinner in the evening with dancing and food. However, King Henry suddenly dies, and Tom is made king, proclaiming that he will not rule in blood. Edward tries to enter the dinner, but is turned away by the crowd. A man named Miles Hendon befriends Edward and takes him back to his place to rest. After Miles and Edward share their stories, Miles plays along with Edward that he is in fact the king and serves him while he eats. Edward then knights Miles and offers him anything he wishes, which Miles requests that he and his heirs always be under the protection of the king. Tom, as king, befriends a whipping boy and frees 3 people who are wrongfully accused of crimes. Edward wanders into the company of vagabonds for the night, where they share stories of their past, and when Edward commands respect because he is the king, the group of men mock him. The group of men and Edward enter a nearby town to cause trouble, and Edward runs away when one of the men gets caught stealing. Edward ends up sleeping in a barn and awakes the next day to the hospitality of a woman and her daughters. However, Tom's father appears at the farm and Edward runs away. Edward meets a hermit who claims to be an archangel and stays with him for the night. However, when Edward mentions that his father was the late King Henry, the hermit ties him up and sharpens his knife. Just as the hermit is about to kill Edward, Miles knocks on the door looking for Edward. The hermit leads Miles away in the woods, but Tom's father finds Edward and takes him back to the gang. The gang goes back into town to steal, and Edward is set up by one of the gang members, who leaves him behind to get arrested. Edward is brought in front of a judge, but Miles defends him in court. On the way to jail, Miles convinces the guard to let Edward go, and Miles and Edward travel to Miles's old home, where his family and large mansion await. However, when Miles arrives at the estate, he is accused of being an imposter because the family believes that Miles died. Because no one seems to know Miles, Miles and Edward are taken to jail, where Edward gets to know the other prisoners. In jail, an old man recognizes Miles, and Miles sacrifices himself to take a whipping for Edward. When Miles and Edward are eventually released, they travel to Westminster to confront Tom at the royal coronation ceremony. Tom enjoys the coronation as he is adored by the people, but as the ceremony continues, he becomes bored and saddened that he's not really the king. Edward then appears and claims to be the real king, but everyone thinks he's lying. Tom then tells the officials that it's true, and the only way to prove it is for Edward to tell them where the Great Seal is located. At first, Edward can't remember, but he eventually remembers and is made king. In the end, King Edward protects Tom and Miles and those he met in the jails, ruling for only a short time until his death. If this video was helpful, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe for more Minute Book Reports, and thanks for watching.
So let's look at the key concept of citizenship in the story of The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. I'm really excited about this bit, so let's start. Let's first profile Tom Canty, who was the pauper in this case. His father / grandmother were abusive to him. This was the history of this particular character. He lived in relative poverty, actually severe poverty. He was forced to beg, and ultimately he stole as well. He was unprotected by his family. He was unprotected by the government, because if you look at the law that was applied in that particular time, we see that it cultivates lawlessness from the poor people of society, or you can call them the working class nowadays. But the key thing was that there were these children that Tom Canty represented in the story were forced into hardship, forced into stealing, forced into slums, or lived in slums, and they was not protected by law, they was not protected by relatives. Actually, it was a reversal. They was forced to beg, and if they and it was and if they was caught stealing, then the law will come down hard on them. Also, it was uneducated, so there was no fostering of any ambition that he may have. There was no real goal for him in life. His life was to live in poverty, to serve his family, and live in a perpetual atmosphere of abuse. His allegiance, though, was to his family, which is admirable about Tom Canty within the story. He was loyal to his family. You see loyalty demonstrated within the story, but it was unfamiliar with the authority. What I mean by that, not that he didn't know where the palace was because we saw him outside of the palace, but it was unfamiliar with what authority do, because the only authority that he ever came in contact with was his father, or in close relationship with was his father and his grandmother, and they were abused. They abused their authority. They abused their position. So all he ever knew about a king, in many ways, was abuse. So himself, I see Tom Canty very admirable as a character. He was still able to keep his innocence even in the state of abuse, which is not many people will react in that particular situation. I think they would have had their innocence stripped from them because of the abuse that they experienced. But Tom Canty was able to be preserved in that situation. He was, though, disobedient to the law. We saw that in this story. But he was forced to disobey the law, not that he desired to, because of the situation he found himself in, being forced by his father and grandmother to do so. He lacked knowledge of his rights and privileges. There were no child laws at that particular time, which we do have now because of the great work of the author Mark Twain, which he really brought to life the slums of London, the ghettos of London at that particular time, and really brought this into the forefront of the political debate at that time. But we can see what Mark Twain was trying to really convey was the lack of rights and privileges, or actually the absence of the rights and privileges for citizens like Tom Canty in that particular British society. So we see Tom had the lack of knowledge, but not because he was willfully ignorant. It's simply because he didn't have the resources presented to him for him to realize his rights and privileges. And also the law did not give him the rights and privileges that the prince had, which we'll go into more details later. He lived like an alien in his fatherland, and we see this. He did not have any rights and privileges. He didn't have any concept of nationalism. He couldn't identify himself with his sovereign. He couldn't identify with the law. He couldn't identify with the government. He couldn't identify with actually citizenship, what that meant. He couldn't really be resourceful as a citizen and really express true culture. So in many ways, this typified that the concept of citizenship was lacking in Tom Canty's life. So that's the portrait of Tom Canty, and we'll get to our next character. So let's have a look at Edward Tudor, who is our prince in this particular story. Well, his father was the king, who was the highest authority of the land. He lived in wealth. He had to follow in the legacy that was left for him, and also advance the legacy of his father. It was protected. It was protected by resources. It was protected by education. It was protected by even the guard who tried to push Tom out of the way and tried to get rid of him from outside of the palace. He was educated, very well educated. He was protected also by the constitution of the land, by the law of the land. He had everything in his palm, really. But one thing about him, he had allegiance to God and the nation, because he has the right of kingship. I forgot what or the concept is again. I actually forgot it on Sunday, but let me pause. He had the divine rights of kings. So that's why I said his allegiance was to God and also to the nation. He believed that God enabled him to rule, and many kings in England at that time believed that. He's an authority in his own right. Remember, he was a prince, so he had jurisdiction. He expected his words to be obeyed, and we saw it in the story when he met the person that actually protected him. He represented the law, and we see that everywhere he went within the story, he was trying to get his will to be done. Every aspect, whenever he met somebody, he commanded them, and he expected obedience. But then when he realized, because he didn't have the resources, he didn't have the protection that he had in the palace, and also because nobody recognized him because he wasn't presented to them as the prince. Instead, he was presented to them in the clothes of the pauper. So they couldn't do what he commanded because they did not see his authority or see him endowed in his authority. He represented the law, as I said, but one thing is he could not really have the demonstration of the law when he was outside of the palace. His will didn't reach far enough when people couldn't recognize him. Which is a brilliant thing, because unless you recognize an authority, it seems then, and also the resources being there, the power being actually demonstrated, you cannot obey them. So if an individual comes to you and says he's the King of Kings, and yet he's not, he doesn't have the myriad of angels and so on and so forth, it is definitely eye-opening that the Jews could not accept Christ because he was not presented to them as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, which he will ultimately. But in this particular story, we see the prince disrobed and clothed in paupery, which meant that the people could not obey his laws. So lack of knowledge of the condition of his people, it was ignorant about his people's living condition. And now that it was in that world, he really realized that he didn't know what people was going through. And it's in many ways, sometimes authority fail to recognize what their subordinates or people they're in charge of are going through. So it's very important for authority to realize the condition of the people who are following them. The lack of impact of the law on his people. He definitely was privy to the law that was made that impact his people, but he didn't realize how impactful it was, because it was through his laws that the people were poor and lived in perpetual poverty. So I think Mark Twain was trying to convey in that particular time that actually the authority and the government of his time were not conscious of the impact of the law on the people on the ground. And also they didn't know the condition of that the people are living in, the children and also the adults. And one thing is, remember, the children ultimately grow into adults. So I could have seen Tom Canty becoming the abusive father as his own father was. and Tom Clancy's wife becoming their abusive grandmother. This will continue. This will be the legacy of the paupers. But in terms of if Edward's mind was not changed, then it will continue a legacy of birthing more paupers. So it was very important that that Edwards was able to take that journey into paupery, so that he may see how the poor people are living, so that he may realize the impact of the law on the people, which is amazing. That this is what I believe our government would definitely have to do to really realize the impact of what laws they make, and the impact it has on the people on the ground, which I believe, because government is so isolated, guess what? They don't really realize the impact of what they do. So, again, Tom lived in isolation. His people were strangers to him. And that is what we have nowadays. We have a government in isolation, centralized, and the people are aliens to them. They are treated like aliens because, again, their government is centralized and the people don't participate in a centralized government in many ways. The only participation you get is the casting of vote, which not all the citizens actually cast their votes. So which shows you that the people are strangers to government in many ways. So let's have a look at Mills Hendon. Mills was born into nobility or privilege. He was forced to go to war under false pretenses. Mills protected his nation by going to war. Mills helped protect Edward's authority, even when people were unaware of it. But one thing about Mills, is that he didn't believe about Edward's identity. He didn't believe that Edward was the prince, which was strange because he still demonstrated patriotism to a pauper in his mind rather than a prince. But the very thing that Edward was trying to tell Mills, we'll see that Mills experienced later. So one thing that Mills was trying to do in the story is that he was trying to claim his birthright, his inheritance. But he experienced similar issues to Edward's. In other words, the people, his own people, didn't recognize Mills because they thought they sold him down the tube, and that he was not the person that he claimed to be. And that is the same thing that Edwards was going through. But one thing about Mills is that he demonstrated patriotism towards Edwards and also unknowingly to him towards the nation, because he was protecting the legacy of the king at that time, which Edward's Tudor was. And this was one thing that the story really got me to look at, the patriotism of Mills. And as we know about patriotism, it protects. One thing is also it conducts itself in a particular way. It preserves heritage, it preserves history, and it preserves inheritance. And we see this with Mills. So for me, Mills is my favorite character in the story because he was cheated out of his inheritance, but he was still willing to protect legacy, protect other people, even though he was lied to, he was betrayed, and he was also shunned. And I love the fact that he was still willing in all of his experiences to still demonstrate great characteristics of patriotism. So let's have a look at our king, who is Jesus Christ of Nazareth, the Messiah of the world, as the prince and the pauper within the story. So I'm going to apply one or two scriptures to the story to really give us a vivid picture of how Christ was like the prince in the story, and also the pauper of the story, and also as males as well, and how he demonstrated patriotism. So before I go into Christ-like characteristic within the different characters of the story, or demonstrated by the different characters of the story, I would like you guys to answer some questions for me as you are home or listening on your phones or on whatever medium you're using. So here are some of the questions. What type of characteristic or similarities do we see Tom demonstrating like Jesus Christ? Okay, so the next question is, what type of characteristics again or similarities do we see Edwards demonstrating like Christ Jesus? So take a minute, go through it, write it down. So the next question is, what type of characteristics or similarities do we see Mills demonstrating like Jesus Christ? It's the same question for each one of the characters, and I just want us to just pen that down, write it down, do types and shadows, especially if you have to go back to the video and have a look at it and then write it down. But I'm just going to point out one or two for each character. So for me, Tom Canty, Christ-like traits or character, one thing that he demonstrated was that, as we know in 1 Corinthians 15:24, Christ actually gave back the throne to the Father. So the Son gave back the kingdoms of this world to his Father. So we see Tom Canty giving back the throne to Edwards. So in the same way. So I extracted that. Oh, that's really very much Christ-like. So let's look at Edwards now. His Christ-like character or traits. One thing that Tom had to go through, Hebrews 4:15, he became aware, or he went through the life of a pauper. So then when he returned back to the throne, we see him demonstrating or applying his experiences when it comes to judgment. So he wasn't estranged from the suffering anymore of his people, and he had to now start making laws in keeping with that. So we have one thing: we have a high priest who is not estranged from our suffering, who is not estranged from what we go through. That's one thing I saw with Edward Tudor's character. One thing that Mills demonstrated is that he was willing to lay down his life for his friend, who was Edwards, and he was willing to take the lashes for Edwards. So in many ways, we see Mills really demonstrate John 15:13. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. And those are little characteristics that I was able to see, and there are much more. And it's a good exercise to just go through the story again. I would recommend a book to us to really go through it, read it, and see Christ-like traits in the three characters, and also to see other characters we may pick up in reference to the scriptures. On that note, thank you guys for definitely listening in. Really appreciate your time, and check out our other videos, and tune in live for the Hub in Acne every Sunday at 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. I'll see you guys later. Have a good day, have a good evening, and I'll catch you very soon.